War never warns you before it arrives. It hits like a thunderclap from nowhere. The planet Ecteri, once a serene, peaceful world, had never seen anything like this before. There was no tension, no feeling of impending danger. But that night, the skies shattered. In a matter of hours, everything changed. The Dravox, a rogue alien faction known for its brutal attacks across the galaxy, decided to strike. They didn't warn anyone. They didn't give any notice. They simply descended upon Ecteri with overwhelming force. Their ships hovered above the cities, casting terrifying shadows as they unleashed devastating orbital bombardments. Fire rained down from the sky, streaking through the atmosphere like deadly stars. Buildings crumbled to the ground in seconds, collapsing into clouds of dust. The air was thick with the cries of the injured, the terrified screams of people caught in the chaos. As the explosions rocked the streets, a once vibrant city was reduced to rubble in the blink of an eye. It was a surprise attack, one that no one saw coming, not even the Ecteri Alliance. The people of this planet never believed they would face such violence. The enemy was ruthless, and they weren't stopping. The Dravox didn't care about innocent lives or the cities they destroyed. They only cared about conquest. To save the planet from total annihilation, the Ecteri Alliance sent out a distress signal to the Human Federation. Humanity had fought wars on far-off planets before. They knew how to fight back against overwhelming odds. They were the underdogs in this intergalactic battle, but that never stopped them. In fact, it fueled their courage. And now, they were coming to Ecteri's aid. Sergeant Daniel Cross, a battle-hardened soldier from Earth, was tasked with leading a special squad to Ecteri. Cross was tall, broad-shouldered, and fearless. He had seen enough war to know that death could come at any moment, and he was always ready to face it head-on. His squad, made up of other elite soldiers, was trained for combat in the harshest environments. They had one mission: protect the Ecteri people and take down the Dravox. But as soon as their boots hit the ground, things started to go wrong. No sooner had they landed than they were ambushed by Dravox forces. Cross was ready. His men were ready, but the attack came faster than they had anticipated. Dravox soldiers, equipped with advanced weaponry, surrounded them. The humans tried to push back, but the enemy was relentless. Within moments, Cross's squad was separated, scattered across the battlefield. It wasn't just the weapons or the enemies that made it difficult, it was the terrain. The city, once so beautiful, now lay in ruins, and the chaos made it impossible to organize an effective counterattack. Cross, though used to these situations, knew he couldn't get his squad back together. His only option was to fight and survive. He signaled his remaining men to fall back to a nearby building, hoping to regroup and reassess. But he didn't have time to rest. As soon as they took cover, a massive Dravox mech, towering over them at 30 feet tall, appeared. Its lasers sliced through the air with terrifying speed. The mech's arm extended, pointing directly at Cross. The human soldiers braced for impact, knowing that they didn't stand a chance against such a giant war machine. Cross knew they were dead. There was no way out. But something unexpected happened. From the corner of his eye, Cross saw a flash of movement. It was a small alien figure darting from behind the debris. At first, he didn't recognize her, but when she drew closer, he realized it was a petted alien, not much taller than 4 feet, darting through the ruins with an unexpected amount of speed and confidence. Her name was Xilari. Xilari was an Ecteri technician, and until now she had been seen as weak, insignificant. No one ever took her seriously. The idea of a petite woman in a war zone seemed laughable to most. But there she was, running toward danger without hesitation. Cross didn't have time to question her actions. The Dravox mech was about to fire, and they were all in its line of sight. But instead of panicking, Xilari ran straight for the mech. Cross's instincts screamed for her to get out of the way, but she didn't listen. She reached the mech in seconds, and with quick precision, she hacked into its systems. Scylla wasn't just running for her life. She was doing something far more incredible. As she pressed buttons on her wrist console, she managed to override the mech's systems. The towering machine suddenly froze. The laser beams that were aimed at Cross turned back on the mech itself. In a matter of seconds, the mech's own weapons turned against it. The massive war machine staggered, then exploded into a burst of fire, falling to the ground in a heap of scrap metal. Scylla stood, breathless, covered in dirt and sweat, as the smoke from the burning mech swirled around her. Cross stood frozen, staring in disbelief. A petted alien girl, no older than a child, had just saved their lives. Her small figure had made the impossible happen. She looked at Cross, her eyes filled with determination and courage. But also, strangely, a quiet sadness. Scylla hadn't come here just to help them. She had come here because she didn't want to be seen as weak anymore. She wanted to prove to herself that she was more than just a small technician. She was more than just the tiny alien that everyone ignored. And in that moment, Cross saw it. He saw beyond her size, beyond her appearance. What he saw was a heart far bigger than anyone could have imagined. In the midst of the war, it was the little things, the unlikely heroes, that made all the difference. Scylla had shown them that size doesn't matter in battle. What matters is the strength of the heart. And right now, Scylla's heart was as big as any soldier's. When the dust finally settled and the echoes of battle faded, Sergeant Daniel Cross stood still, his mind racing. The battlefield, once a bustling city filled with life, now lay in ruins, a shadow of what it used to be. His squad was injured, scattered, and stuck behind enemy lines. The situation was dire, and yet something extraordinary had just happened. Scylla, a small 4-foot-tall alien, had just saved his life, and the lives of his remaining men. She had hacked into a massive Drovox mech and turned it against its own forces. The sheer audacity of it left Cross in awe. How could someone so small, so seemingly insignificant, possess such immense bravery and intelligence? The image of Scylla standing amidst the wreckage of the mech, with nothing but determination in her eyes, was seared into his mind. She didn't flinch in the face of danger. While most of the soldiers would have frozen or panicked, she had acted with precision, without hesitation. Cross couldn't quite figure her out. Scylla was different from anyone he had ever met. Despite her size, she was resourceful and fearless, but there was something about her that still didn't add up. She was clearly intelligent, resourceful, and determined. Yet, she wore an air of insecurity that Cross couldn't shake off. It was strange to him. She had just taken down an entire mech, single-handedly, but she still acted like someone who didn't believe in their own worth. Cross knew he needed answers, but there was no time for questions. They had to keep moving. The mission was far from over. The Drovox were still out there, and they weren't going to stop. Cross's injured squad needed to get to safety, but that wouldn't be easy. The Drovox had already begun to fortify their position, and the humans were stuck deep within enemy territory. Cross, along with a handful of surviving soldiers, moved cautiously through the ruins of the city. They were careful not to make too much noise. The last thing they needed was to draw the attention of the Drovox again. They were fighting an enemy with far superior technology, and every step they took had to be calculated. As they moved through the streets, Cross found himself glancing back at Scylla. She was walking ahead of him, her small form moving with purpose. She had become their guide, their only hope of escaping the Drovox's reach. Scylla had lived on this planet all her life. She knew the city's underground tunnels, the hidden routes that could get them past enemy patrols. But even with her knowledge, they were in constant danger. The Drovox were relentless. Over time, a strange bond began to form between Cross and Scylla. He began to trust her more, seeing her not just as an ally, but as someone capable of more than what the world had allowed her to be. He had spent his life on the front lines, fighting in wars, surviving through the worst that humanity had to offer. But this was different. There was something about Silari that challenged everything he thought he knew about courage and strength. She didn't fit the usual mold of a soldier. She wasn't large or imposing. She wasn't even a warrior. Yet, she had proved herself on that battlefield. But as their trust in each other deepened, Cross couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Silari had shown them the escape routes, helped them avoid enemy patrols, and even fixed their equipment when it was damaged. She was invaluable. And yet she still didn't seem to believe in her own worth. The way she kept looking over her shoulder, the way she hesitated before making decisions, it all pointed to one thing: insecurity. Why? How could someone so capable, so brilliant, feel this way? Cross didn't have time to ask her. The mission wasn't over yet, and they were still deep behind enemy lines. But it was when they were making their way through an underground tunnel that Cross's suspicions were confirmed, or at least partially. The ground trembled as explosions went off overhead, shaking the earth beneath them. Cross knew that the Dravoks weren't far. The last thing they needed was for their location to be compromised. They needed to move faster, but they had to be careful. Just as they reached a narrow passageway, Cross noticed something strange. One of his soldiers, Private Benner, who had been acting strangely since the start of the mission, was moving too slowly. He was lagging behind, and Cross could see that he was looking around nervously. The rest of the squad was ahead, but Benner was looking back over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to come for him. "Benner," Cross barked, snapping him out of his trance. "Pick up the pace." But Benner didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was shaky. "Sir, I don't think we're alone." Cross narrowed his eyes. He had learned to trust his gut over the years, and it told him something was wrong. "What do you mean?" Benner hesitated, his face pale. I think someone's tipped off the Dravoks. Our location, it's been compromised." Cross felt his heart skip a beat. He'd known there was something off about this mission. The Dravoks were too organized, too precise in their attacks. But he had been too focused on survival to consider the possibility that they might have a traitor in their midst. His eyes flicked over to Silari, who was walking ahead, oblivious to the conversation. Was it possible that someone had leaked their position to the enemy? The trust he had placed in the Ekteri alliance was starting to crumble. "Stay alert," Cross ordered his squad. "We need to find out who's behind this, and fast. No one is to trust anyone but each other until we figure out who the traitor is." Silari stopped when she heard his voice, turning to face him. "What's going on?" Cross didn't want to involve her, but it was clear she would have to know. "Someone sold us out," he said grimly. "We've got a traitor in our midst." Silari's eyes widened. "You think it's me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cross immediately shook his head. "No, I don't know who it is yet, but we need to stick together. We can't afford to trust anyone else right now." Silari's face fell slightly, a shadow crossing her features. For a brief moment, she looked like the same uncertain girl Cross had met on the battlefield. The one who wasn't sure she belonged. But in the chaos of the moment, Cross couldn't afford to dwell on that. They needed to figure out who had betrayed them, and fast. As the tension mounted, Silari quietly pulled out a small device from her pack. "I can track the enemy," she said, her voice steadier than before. "If we follow the signals, we can find out where they're planning to hit us next." Cross nodded. He didn't know if he could fully trust her, but right now she was their best chance. The small alien girl had proven herself on the battlefield. He had to believe that she could help them get through this, even if the odds were stacked against them. Together, they would have to face the truth and figure out who among them was the real enemy. The attack came without warning, more brutal than anything Cross had ever experienced. The Dravoks forces had launched their offensive with overwhelming force, unleashing a deadly barrage that left no room for escape. The skies were filled with fire as massive enemy ships hovered above the city, their weapons unleashing devastating energy beams. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning debris, and the ground shook with the force of explosions. Cross and Silari were part of a small team sent on an infiltration mission to sabotage an enemy communications relay. The goal was simple: cripple the Drovox's ability to coordinate their forces, buying time for the human soldiers and their allies to regroup. But things rarely went according to plan in war. Their aircraft had barely made it through the enemy defenses when a sudden explosion rocked it, causing the vessel to spin out of control. The once sleek, advanced ship groaned under the strain of the impact. The hull buckled, and the roar of the engines went silent, replaced by the shrill scream of alarms. Cross gritted his teeth, trying to regain control, but it was futile. The ship plummeted toward the ground, the landscape rushing up to meet them. In the chaos of the crash, Cross felt his body slammed against the restraints, pain shooting through his chest. His vision blurred as the ship crashed into the ground with a bone-shattering impact. The explosion sent debris flying in every direction, but miraculously, Cross and Silari were thrown clear of the wreckage. When Cross regained consciousness, he was lying on the cold, hard ground, surrounded by the wreckage of their downed aircraft. His head throbbed, and his body ached, but he quickly pushed the pain aside. He had a job to do. He looked around and saw Silari, a few feet away, shaken but alive. The small alien was already scrambling to her feet, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Her nimbleness in the face of danger always impressed Cross, but today he saw something different in her eyes. She was focused, determined, but also vulnerable. Her usual confidence seemed to have faltered in the wake of the crash. "Silari," Cross called, struggling to stand. His legs were wobbly, but he pushed himself to his feet. "We need to move. Now." Silari nodded, though she didn't say anything. She was already pulling out a small device from her pack and scanning the area. She was used to surviving in hostile environments, and that was one of the things Cross had come to respect about her. Despite her size and seemingly fragile appearance, she was incredibly resourceful. "We're deep in enemy territory," Silari said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of concern. "The Drovox forces will be looking for us. We need to find cover and figure out a way to communicate with the others." Cross knew she was right. They had to move quickly, or they'd be trapped in the heart of the enemy's stronghold. The Drovox were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to capture or eliminate anyone who stood in their way. They moved silently, staying low to the ground as they navigated through the ruined landscape. The city was a maze of debris, with towering buildings now reduced to smoldering ruins. Every step they took felt like a risk, but there was no other choice. The team's mission depended on them, and failure was not an option. As they moved deeper into the wreckage, Cross couldn't help but notice how Silari acted. She wasn't just focused on the mission. She was constantly looking around, making sure that the injured human soldiers they had left behind were being taken care of. She was a technician, not a soldier, yet she moved with a purpose that was rare to see in anyone. Every time they passed an injured soldier, Silari would stop, check their wounds, and offer what help she could, no matter how small. Her hands were steady as she worked, patching up torn uniforms or applying pressure to bleeding wounds. She didn't hesitate, even when it meant exposing herself to danger. Her willingness to put others before herself was astonishing to Cross. It was as if her concern for the others was stronger than her own survival instinct. After what felt like hours, they finally found a temporary shelter. They had hidden themselves in the ruins of a collapsed building, a small alcove that offered just enough cover to stay out of sight. Cross leaned against the rubble, trying to catch his breath, and watched as Silari continued to help the soldiers who had made it out of the crash. It was in this moment, amidst the chaos and the bloodshed, that Cross realized something. Silari wasn't just a brilliant technician. She was a fighter in her own way. She had a heart bigger than anyone he had ever known. And yet she didn't think much of herself. She was constantly downplaying her contributions, never accepting praise, never taking credit for her actions. Cross couldn't understand why. As the night fell, the tension grew even more palpable. They couldn't stay in the same place for long. The Dravox would be searching for them soon. Cross watched as Sci-Fi tended to the wounded, her movements fluid and focused, but the same insecurity still lingered in her eyes. Unable to resist, Cross finally spoke up. "Sci-Fi, why do you do it?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "Why help others when you're risking your life to do it? You don't owe anyone anything." Sci-Fi paused for a moment, her hand stilling over the bandages she was applying to one soldier's arm. She didn't look at him right away, as if weighing her words carefully. Then, with a deep breath, she finally spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "I may be small," she said, "but I've always wanted someone to see me for who I truly am. I've spent so much of my life being overlooked, being told I wasn't strong enough, that I wasn't capable. But I want to be seen. I want someone to recognize that I have value, that I'm not just a small alien who doesn't matter." Cross stood there, stunned by her honesty. He had never imagined that someone like Sci-Fi, so brilliant and capable, could feel this way. It was a humbling moment for him, and the weight of her words hit him harder than any explosion ever could. In that moment, he understood her in a way he hadn't before. "You matter, Sci-Fi," Cross said, his voice sincere. "You've done more than most people I've known, and I trust you. We wouldn't have made it this far without you." Sci-Fi's eyes met his then, and for the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. It was fleeting, but it was there. For a brief moment, the weight of her insecurities seemed to lift. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe it. But before they could talk further, the sound of enemy footsteps broke the moment. Cross's hand went instinctively to his weapon, his senses alert. They were not alone anymore. The Dravox were closing in, and the fight was far from over. The jungle around them was eerily quiet. The low hum of the Dravox's cloaking device was barely audible, a constant reminder of how they were being watched, stalked by an enemy that could appear out of nowhere. Cross felt the tension in the air, the weight of every step they took, knowing the Dravox could be right behind them, hidden from view. Sci-Fi, always the perceptive one, noticed the change in the atmosphere. She had been quiet for some time, scanning their surroundings with sharp eyes, looking for any sign of danger. Her hands were tense, constantly moving over the devices she had strapped to her suit, ensuring their comms were still intact and that they weren't being jammed. "I don't like this," Sci-Fi muttered, almost to herself. Cross glanced at her, his eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "Something's off. We've been moving for hours, and I haven't heard anything from the rest of the team. They should have checked in by now." She hesitated, then added, "And there's something wrong with the ground. It's too quiet. I feel like we're walking into a trap." Cross furrowed his brow, his gaze sweeping over the thick foliage. He knew she was right, but they had no choice but to keep moving. The Dravox were notorious for their stealth technology, and they'd already been too close to the enemy stronghold to turn back. They had to find and destroy the cloaking device if they were going to survive and turn the tide of the war. "Let's keep moving. We need to find that device," Cross said, his voice firm. Sci-Fi nodded, but her hesitation remained. They both knew the odds were against them. The cloaking device was housed deep within a heavily fortified Dravox stronghold, surrounded by their best soldiers. Getting past the enemy's defenses was going to be a monumental challenge. It almost seemed impossible. After hours of trekking through the dense jungle, they finally arrived at the outskirts of the Dravox stronghold. From their vantage point, the complex appeared nearly invisible, blending perfectly into the surrounding environment. It was a technological marvel, designed to be undetectable to anyone who wasn't actively searching for it. Cross crouched down behind a cluster of rocks, peering through his binoculars. He could make out the faint outlines of the enemy's patrols, moving in and out of the compound with practiced precision. The cloaking device was powerful, but even with its interference, Cross could sense the heavy presence of the Dravok soldiers. "We can't approach this head-on," Cross said, lowering the binoculars. "We need a distraction, something to draw their attention away from the device." Silari stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "I'll do it." Cross turned sharply, his expression stern. "No, you're staying with me. It's too dangerous for you to go in alone." Silari didn't flinch. "You need me, Sergeant. I can get past their defenses. I know the technology, and I can hack into their systems faster than anyone else. You can't do this without me." Cross clenched his jaw. He had always trusted Silari's intelligence, but this mission was different. They couldn't afford to lose anyone, especially not her. The squad had already lost so much. "I'm not risking your life. We stick together, or we don't go at all." Silari met his gaze, her eyes unblinking. "You're not in charge of me, Cross. I'm going with or without you. I'll complete the mission, and I'll do it without getting caught." There was a moment of silence between them. Cross's heart raced as he processed her words. He knew she was right. She was the only one who could pull this off. And as much as it hurt him to admit it, he understood that he couldn't keep holding her back. Silari was strong, maybe stronger than he had given her credit for. "Fine," Cross muttered, finally relenting. "But you're not going in alone. I'll cover you." Silari's face softened, but only for a moment. "You can't afford to get caught either. Stay hidden, and if something goes wrong, you get out. I'll finish the job." Cross didn't like it, but he understood her resolve. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about trust. And if there was anyone he could trust in this war, it was Silari. The plan was set. Silari would infiltrate the stronghold, disable the cloaking device, and allow the rest of the Alliance to strike. Cross's squad would stay out of sight, providing cover if needed. It was risky, but it was their only option. As Silari prepared to leave, she glanced back at Cross. Her usual bravado was there, but there was something more in her eyes now. A flicker of vulnerability. "Just make sure you're still there when I finish," she said quietly. Cross gave her a solemn nod. "I'll be waiting for you." Without another word, Silari disappeared into the shadows, moving swiftly and silently. She was a ghost in the night, her small figure blending into the terrain as if she was part of the very environment itself. Cross watched her go, his gut tightening with anxiety. He trusted her, but war had a way of making even the best plans fall apart. He could only hope that her skills were enough to outsmart the Dravoks. Silari navigated through the dense jungle with remarkable ease. She used every bit of her technical expertise to disable enemy sensors and avoid patrols. Her small size worked in her favor, allowing her to slip through cracks and gaps in the enemy's defenses without being seen. Every step she took brought her closer to the cloaking device, but with each passing second, the danger grew. When she finally reached the heart of the Dravok stronghold, Silari took a deep breath, steeling herself. The cloaking device was hidden inside a heavily guarded control room, its systems protected by advanced security measures. But she was ready. Her fingers flew over the small interface panel she carried with her, bypassing security systems with expert precision. The digital world around her lit up with the soft glow of code. She hacked into the Dravok's network, her mind working at lightning speed. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down, as if the world outside had paused, and the only thing that mattered was the task at hand. But the second she initiated the sequence to disable the cloaking device, the alarms went off. The sound of sirens pierced the air, and red lights began flashing around the facility. Silari cursed under her breath, knowing she had been discovered. The Dravoks were quick to react, and now the compound was on high alert. She had moments before the enemy would overwhelm her position. Cross was right. This was a trap. Silari had no choice now but to make a run for it. But as she turned to retreat, she heard a familiar sound, the hum of cloaked enemy mechs activating. The trap had already been set. She had walked right into it. Silari barely had time to react as the stronghold began to crumble around them. Cross was at her side, though he was barely standing. His face was pale, his body covered in blood, but he was there. He was with her. But before they could make their escape, the last wave of Dravok's soldiers descended on them. Cross didn't hesitate for a second. He pulled Silari behind him, taking the brunt of the enemy's assault. He fought like a man possessed, taking down soldier after soldier, but his body was betraying him. Every movement was a struggle, and his vision was fading fast. Cross, Silari gasped, grabbing his arm. You need to rest. I'm fine, Cross grunted, his voice hoarse. But they both knew he wasn't. His strength was fading, and there was no way he could keep fighting at this rate. Stay with me, please, Silari pleaded, her voice breaking. We've come this far. Cross looked at her, his eyes softening. He knew he couldn't keep going much longer. The pain was too much, and his body was giving out. But before he could say anything, the human forces broke through, and the Dravok's forces were finally overwhelmed. As Cross was dragged to safety, blood staining the ground beneath him, he couldn't help but smile through the pain. Silari was safe. The mission was a success, and for the first time since the battle began, Cross allowed himself to relax. As the medics moved him onto a stretcher, Cross turned his head toward Silari, who was standing nearby, her face a mixture of concern and relief. He smiled weakly at her. You're small, but your heart. It's the biggest thing here, he said, his voice filled with admiration. Silari's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She simply nodded, holding on to the moment. They had made it through together, and nothing could change that. As the medics worked on Cross, Silari stood watch over him, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and affection. She had always believed in herself, but this was something more. With Cross by her side, she felt like she could conquer anything. The battle was over, but their journey was just beginning. The war was finally over. After weeks of relentless combat, countless lives lost, and the heavy toll of both physical and emotional scars, the alliance between Silari's people and the humans had triumphed. The Dravoks had been defeated, their forces scattered and retreating, leaving the battlefield silent, save for the distant sounds of cleanup and recovery. It was a victory, but the cost had been immense. Cross had been unconscious for days after the battle, his injuries severe, but he had pulled through. The medics had worked tirelessly to heal him, patching him up as best as they could. Still, the recovery process was slow. Every movement was painful, every breath a reminder of the fight he had survived. But through it all, one thought remained constant in his mind: Silari. He had not forgotten how she had single-handedly disabled the cloaking device, how she had risked her life to ensure their victory. Her bravery, her heart, had become something he admired deeply. In those moments when he had been at his weakest, she had been his strength, and that was something he could never forget. The day Cross was finally cleared to leave the medical bay, he didn't waste a second. He knew exactly where he was going, straight to find Silari. He needed to talk to her, to tell her everything that had been building up inside him ever since they had first met. Silari, for her part, had not changed much in the aftermath of the battle. She was still the same fierce and capable warrior, but there was an air of quiet doubt around her. The war was over, yes, but in the silence that followed, Silari couldn't shake the feeling that she was still not quite enough. She had proven herself in battle, no doubt, but deep inside, she struggled to believe that she could ever be truly equal to those around her. She had always been small, delicate in appearance, and for much of her life, she had been overlooked. In a galaxy filled with powerful beings and towering warriors, Silari often felt like a mere speck of dust, insignificant and too small to matter. Even after everything she had done, even after she had risked her life to disable the cloaking device and turn the tide of the battle, a small part of her still believed that she was nothing more than a tool, a weapon, a mere ally in the eyes of others. That's when she saw him, Cross, walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps. his face etched with exhaustion, but also determination. He had been through hell and back. But his eyes told a different story. They were filled with gratitude, with something deeper that Silari couldn't quite place. Cross, Silari said quietly, her voice almost hesitant. You're up and about. Cross gave her a tired but warm smile. I wouldn't miss this for the world, he replied, his voice rough but sincere. Silari tilted her head slightly, confusion flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? I mean, Cross said, his gaze steady. I've been meaning to thank you. For everything. You did more than I could ever imagine. You were the one who saved us all. Silari shook her head, her expression softening but still filled with doubt. I just did my part. I'm nothing special. There are others who did just as much, if not more. Cross reached out, gently placing his hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her in the present. No, Silari, that's where you're wrong. You were the one who kept us all going when everything seemed lost. You were the one who put everything on the line. Her heart raced at his words, a sense of warmth blossoming in her chest, but the old insecurities crept back in. I don't feel like I'm anyone's equal. I'm small, I'm weak, and I'm always overlooked. I've never been enough, Cross. Cross looked at her with something akin to disbelief. Silari, you're not weak. You've never been weak. Sometimes the smallest things, the ones that seem insignificant, are the strongest. You have something that most people don't. Courage, heart. You're willing to risk everything for the people around you. That makes you more powerful than you could ever know. Silari felt a lump form in her throat as Cross's words sank in. She had always doubted herself, had always been afraid of being seen as lesser, but in that moment, with his words and his steady gaze, something shifted within her. Maybe she wasn't as small and insignificant as she had always believed. Maybe, just maybe, she was enough. I didn't do it for praise, she whispered, her eyes not meeting his. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I know, Cross replied gently, his voice softening. But that's what makes you stand out. You don't do it for the recognition. You do it because you care, because you're willing to protect those who can't protect themselves. Silari's heart fluttered in her chest as she looked up at him. His sincerity was overwhelming, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe him. Maybe she wasn't just an ally. Maybe she wasn't just a weapon. Maybe she was something more. Cross took a step closer to her, his gaze unwavering. Silari, I need you to understand something. You're not just an ally to me. You're my protector. You inspire me more than anyone else ever could. You remind me of what it means to fight for something greater than yourself. You are everything to me. Silari's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of his words, the intensity of his emotions. Her mind raced, but her heart seemed to know exactly what to do. She took a deep breath, the weight of her own fears and doubts momentarily lifting, and reached out, taking his hand in hers. I didn't think anyone could see me for who I really am, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. But you do. Cross smiled softly and gently squeezed her hand. I see you, Silari. I always have. The air between them seemed to shift in that moment, as if the entire world had paused just to let them understand the unspoken connection they had formed through their struggles, their sacrifices, and their triumphs. Silari looked up at him, her heart full of warmth and gratitude. She may have been small, she may have been overlooked, but in this moment, she knew that she was enough. And for the first time, she truly believed it. Her fingers tightened around his hand, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and love. Thank you, Cross, she whispered, her voice steady now. For everything. Cross gazed at her, his eyes softening with affection. You don't need to thank me. You've already done more than enough. And as their hands remained clasped together, Silari finally realized what she had been missing all along, not just her strength, but the belief in herself that she had so long lacked. She wasn't small, she wasn't weak, she was brave, she was capable, and with Cross by her side, she could face anything that came her way. The war had ended, but their journey together was only just beginning.